New York City did not grow on dreams alone. It grew on the shoulders of people who had almost nothing left to lose. In the late 1800s and early 1900s, the city was expanding at a furious pace. Millions of immigrants from Italy, Ireland, Eastern Europe, China, and many other places flooded into Manhattan, chasing even the smallest promise of opportunity. By 1900, more than 80% of New Yorkers were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Packed into neighborhoods built for far fewer people, they arrived to find a city stretched beyond its limits. Tenements stacked families like freight, rooms without light, without air, and sometimes without running water. Entire blocks relied on a single shared outhouse. Disease spread faster than hope. For many, childhood was not a phase of life, it was a duty, and still within this brutal reality there was strength. Hard, unyielding survival. Jacob Riis captured it all through his camera. The overcrowded rooms, the alleys where children slept, the tired faces of people who kept moving forward anyway. This was New York before the skyscrapers, the city that shaped America, a city built from poverty and relentless labor by those simply trying to survive on streets that had become their home. Welcome to Animata History, bringing life back into historic photographs from across the world to remind us how people once lived, where we came from, and what shaped who we are today. In this episode, we are reanimating street life in New York during the late 1800s. In the 1880s, 334,000 people were squeezed into a single square mile of Manhattan's Lower East Side, making it the most densely populated place on Earth. They were crowded into filthy, disease-filled tenements, 10 or 15 people to a room, while the wealthy knew little about them and cared even less. The slums of Manhattan existed as a world of their own. Tight, brick-lined canyons where sunlight barely reached the ground. Families were forced into airless tenement rooms carved from old warehouses and divided again and again until entire lives unfolded in spaces no bigger than a horse stall. Narrow courtyards patched with broken boards and sagging roofs became the only outdoor spaces these residents knew. The stench of coal smoke, rotting trash, and too many bodies hung heavy in the streets. Most who lived here did not come looking for suffering. They arrived chasing the promise of America. Irish escaping famine, Italians fleeing deep poverty, Jewish families running from persecution in Europe. They arrived with nothing but hope, and a city bursting at the seams pushed them into the only homes they could afford, the overcrowded tenements of the Lower East Side and Hell's Kitchen. Piece by piece, they rebuilt their lives amid the noise and chaos. Sewing shops and kitchens, street markets outside their doors, children playing in alleys that also served as garbage dumps. Life was harsh, yes, but for many it was still better than what they had left behind. The slum was not their end goal, it was their beginning, the first step toward a new life. Jacob Riis, How the Other Half Lives. Jacob Riis arrived in New York from Denmark in 1870 with almost nothing, just another immigrant searching for a chance. Instead, he found a city drowning in poverty and overcrowded tenements. After drifting through various odd jobs, he became a police reporter, following officers into the darkest corners of the Lower East Side. What he witnessed there changed him forever. He saw how a city full of promise and hope was, in truth, weighed down by people struggling just to survive. When Riis came to New York City, he was one of countless migrants and immigrants seeking success in a newly industrialized world who moved to urban centers after the American Civil War. Around 24 million people relocated to cities, causing urban populations to grow 8 times over. Riis used his camera and his writing to show the public a reality most preferred not to see. His groundbreaking 1890 book, How the Other Half Lives, revealed the brutal living conditions of the urban poor and pushed New York toward serious housing reform. His work drew the attention of Police Commissioner Theodore Roosevelt, who became both a supporter and a close friend. A 1905 photograph of Riis standing beside Roosevelt and educator John Hale Vincent captures that moment in history. The once struggling immigrant, now beside a future president, recognized for exposing truths others refused to acknowledge. After Roosevelt became president, he wrote a tribute to Riis in the March 1901 issue of McClure's magazine. He wrote, "The countless evils which hide in the dark corners of our civic life, which roam through the slums and make their permanent home in crowded tenement houses, have found in Mr. Riis the strongest opponent they have ever faced in New York City. Powerful words from such an influential figure in an era when childhood meant labor. In 19th century New York, child labor existed because families were too poor to survive without every member working. Immigrant parents earned pennies. Rent was crushing. Factories demanded cheap, small, easily controlled workers. Children fit into tight spaces, worked long hours for almost no pay, and had little to no legal protection. In a city growing faster than its conscience, childhood was often sacrificed just to keep a roof overhead and food on the table. These photographs capture the pulse of those streets, such as this moment of a poor young girl holding a baby while sitting in a doorway beside a garbage can. Scenes like this were common then, but would shock people if seen in New York today. Looking back at these historic images, it becomes clear just how different childhood once was from our own. In fact, it was Jacob Riis who inspired social photographer Lewis Hine, whose images later helped end child labor in America. We explored Hine's influence on child labor laws in an earlier video, which you can still find on this channel if you have not yet seen it. Here, Riis photographed a young girl walking the streets of Manhattan on her way back to her tenement, carrying what he described as cloth homework meant for sewing. As Lewis Hine later documented in detail, at the start of the 20th century it was common for children to help their parents work from home. Idle hands often meant hunger and homelessness in those days, and honestly, even those who worked nonstop frequently faced the same outcome. Here we see a family of Czech immigrants making cigars inside their living space. The man and woman work at a cigar mold. The oldest child prepares tobacco leaves while the youngest sits quietly nearby. This well-known photograph shows 9-year-old Katie from the West 52nd Street Industrial School who kept house on West 49th Street. When Riis asked what kind of work she did, she quickly answered, "Ice scrubs." Riis noted that her expression promised whatever she scrubbed would come out clean. Katie lived on the top floor of a tenement with her older sister and 2 brothers, all of whom worked. Their mother had died and their father had remarried. Katie took on nearly all the household tasks, including scrubbing, sweeping, and cooking for her working siblings. In the photograph, she appears far older than her 9 years, her serious and distant expression reflecting the weight and hardship of her life. Riis used this image as a key feature in his 1892 book The Children of the Poor to show the suffering of poor children in New York's slums. Child care was not even considered labor. It was simply expected that older children would care for the younger ones while adults worked long, exhausting hours for little pay. But for the child placed in that role, it meant setting aside their own childhood while taking on responsibilities we would now see as adult duties. Infant mortality in late 19th century New York was shocking. Between the 1870s and 1890s, nearly 1 in 4 children died before reaching the age of 5. Tuberculosis, cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and measles spread rapidly through overcrowded neighborhoods. Dirty water, poor sanitation, and tightly packed tenements turned daily life into a constant fight for survival. In New York's slum districts, the average life expectancy rarely exceeded 30 years. Compare that to the wealthiest parts of the city, where people often lived 20 years longer or more. Within the same city, a single street could determine how long someone lived. In a time when childhood meant work, there was no space for idle hands. If children did not contribute to the family's income in some way, it could bring disaster for everyone. This was not an error of choice, but one of necessity. The lack of jobs in the city often pushed people toward crime as a means of survival. In a narrow street in Hell's Kitchen, boys reenact the method they used to steal from people who had collapsed unconscious. This was not play, but survival shaped by their surroundings. Poverty, overcrowding, and neglect turned childhood into training for the streets. A dead horse lies rotting in the road, ignored amid everyday life and play. In neighborhoods like these, poverty erased the line between childhood and hardship, leaving little room for innocence. In this image, Riis photographed a group of children gathered in Mullins Alley in the Cherry Hill area of Lower Manhattan. In a city weighed down by hardship, poverty, and the fight to survive, staying together during rare moments of free time was essential. On a sweltering summer day in PUNCTUATO in 1912, children gather around a large block of ice, licking its cold surface to escape the heavy heat. In packed streets where comfort was rare, even a short touch of cold felt like a shared luxury. Jacob Riis often came across sleeping children while moving through the city with his camera, collapsed from exhaustion after long hours of labor and sleepless nights. Here we see a young girl slumped face down inside a crumbling New York apartment, her head just inches away from the stove and filthy iron cooking pots. These young boys were photographed trying to stay warm on Mulberry Street, one of the most notorious overcrowded slum passages in New York City and a main focus of Jacob Riis's work. Much of the worst area, Mulberry Bend, was torn down in the 1890s and replaced by Columbus Park, but the street itself still remains today. In the later years of the 19th century in New York City, historians estimate that between 30,000 and 60,000 children were homeless and living on the streets at any one time. New York's total population in 1890 was about 1.5 million. This meant street children were not rare cases but a constant and visible part of daily life. At night, children took whatever shelter the city could offer: doorways, staircases, corners of stone and brick. Worn down by work and hunger, they slept wherever they fell, unprotected and unseen. These scenes were not unusual, but common sights on New York streets where childhood ended too soon and survival mattered most. Real street life in old New York is captured in Bandit's Roost, one of Riis's most well-known photographs. Taken in a narrow alley off Mulberry Street, it reveals a space few outsiders ever saw. The men and boys gathered there lived by street rules shaped by poverty, crowding, and neglect. This photograph also helped spark change. Within 10 years, the Mulberry Bend slum was condemned, destroyed, and wiped from the map. The alley disappeared, replaced by open air and public parkland, becoming one of the first urban reforms driven by photography. Riis described these men as dock rats drinking beer beneath a dock. He explained, "That's their work by day, drinking beer. At night they come out and creep along the waterfront. There they wait. And if their victim foolishly resists or cries out, well, dead men tell no tales." When Jacob Riis first learned about flash photography the year it was invented in 1887, his interest in using photography to expose New York's slums grew serious. Along with two amateur photographers who were also curious about flash, Riis became one of the earliest people to use it in real-world conditions. His famous image, Bandit's Roost, was not actually taken by Riis himself, but by one of his photographer friends testing flash for the first time. Riis took this picture during a nighttime raid with sanitary police, who were there to shut the place down for illegally housing people for 5 cents a night instead of the required 7. His camera flash exploded with a loud bang, jolting the unsuspecting men awake from sleep. You can see that some of them had not even opened their eyes yet. Riis may not have discovered Chinatown, but he made it visible to audiences who preferred to look away, connecting the neighborhood to wider discussions about urban poverty and reform. In his first lecture, Riis said, "Parts of New York City are truly like the fires of hell. 3/4 of the people live in tenements, 37,000 tenements, and nearly 1.2 million people call them home. For tens of thousands of others in the city, even a tenement was out of reach." Riis found beggars and tramps throughout Manhattan and described homelessness as a system-wide problem, not something rare but always present. "Please, sir, spare a coin. Anything at all, I'm starving." On January 25, 1888, Riis delivered his first lecture, How the Other Half Lives and Dies in New York. Speaking of one image, he said, "I told him if he would sit still for a minute so I could take his picture, I'd give him 10 cents. That was probably the first and only 10 cents that man ever earned by honest work in his entire life. In the low, broken space beneath the dump, a man bends quietly over the refuse at his feet. He works without haste, his hands moving only within reach, as if this small patch of ground is all he owns. Light cuts down sharply from above, lighting what others have thrown away, and what he must dig through to survive. The Rivington Street dump was not a landfill in the modern sense, but an open refuge dump and sorting ground used by New York City in the late 19th century. Jacob Riis photographed and described it as a place where people lived fully off what the city discarded. In a coal cellar on Lello Street, a man sits at a table to observe the Sabbath. The space is dark and improvised, pressed tight by need. Still, the ritual remains. Bread sits before him. His gaze is steady and alert, meeting the world beyond the frame. Here, even underground, dignity and belief survive beside hardship. This man has built a simple bed and lies resting on a narrow wooden plank supported by barrels in a dark cellar. Without the work of Riis as a journalist on a mission and the invention of flash photography, images like these would never have existed. While describing this image, Riis said, "Let's go down into one of the alleys and see what happens there at 3 in the morning. For 2 cents, you can get a round of drinks and the right to sleep all night on the table or under it." Tramps. All of them. These images cast light into the darkest corners of a city destined for greatness. History shows us the pain and errors of the past to remind us to keep the light shining and expose the darkness within our ever-changing society. Because it is in the light, and only in the light, that truth and equality for all can finally prevail.